Hello, and welcome to Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity. Subscribe to the channel to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors and try to come to tentative conclusions about them. Egyptian history covers such an absurdly long period of time that it's easy to overlook some periods. I'm certainly guilty of this. For example, I find history far less interesting once the Hellenistic world kind of took over. While Alexander and Rome by themselves are fascinating, they make Egyptian history less interesting to me. I think it's just less mysterious because we have far more primary sources. There are long tracts of time where Egyptians aren't even in control of Egypt. For example, Herodotus visited Egypt in the 26th dynasty. At that time, the land was ruled by the Sate, who were Assyrian Persians. You can even see Persian influence in many of the 26th dynasty artifacts. He specifically mentioned visiting Giza and traveling as far south as Aswan. But he also talked about the construction. Strangely, he asserts that they were constructed with wooden cranes that have come to be called the Herodotus Machine, and they were constructed from the top down? The fuck? This is confusing, and most historians believe he either embellished, was being screwed with by the locals, or simply made it up. Some think maybe the casings were applied from the top down, which kinda makes sense if you're removing a ramp at the same time, but I'm pretty sure I figured out exactly what Herodotus' machine was. But before I tell you, let's talk about the bent pyramid. Yeah, I know we're kind of starting off all over the place, but I promise it'll all come together. The most common interpretation of the bent pyramid's shape are either that Snefru died before it was filled out, or that it became structurally unsound and the shallower angle was needed to prevent it from crushing the bedrock. Though we're not sure what the ancients thought of the bent one. There was a cult presence there for seemingly 1,000 years, so it seems to me unlikely that the ancients saw it as a failure. Then again, this shape was not reused by his successors. It was likely seen as an evolutionary stepping stone to the final perfect pyramid shape. But that doesn't mean it was a failure. If only someone else built a bent pyramid, or even better, 3 or 4 of them right next to each other, that'd show us that at least it could have been considered a finished shape. Welcome to Sudan, just south of Egypt, and from the time of Snefru all the way to the Third Intermediate Period, home to the Nubians, which would partially become the Kingdom of Kush. This video will be a brief overview of the Nubians and Kush Empire, and a comparison between their pyramids and those of their northern neighbors. Back to Herodotus. If you asked a person now how we would build something impressive, say a skyscraper, well, most of it is cranes, reinforced concrete, steel, right? What about these? This medieval Italian city of Bologna has skyscrapers too, made in the 1300s. If I ask a Bologna architect, how do you build a skyscraper? They'll tell me how we build them in the modern day, not the 1300s. So if Herodotus asked a 26th dynasty Egyptian, how do you build a pyramid? Wouldn't it make sense that they'd tell them how the 26th dynasty would do it, not the 4th dynasty 2,000 years earlier? Of course, the Sates did not build pyramids. They simply fixed up the ones that were already there. So if the Egyptians weren't currently building pyramids, they'd likely tell you how they most recently did it. That would have been the 25th dynasty, when the Kush ruled. And although they no longer ruled Egypt, by the time Herodotus visited, the empire still existed, and they were still building pyramids. They built dozens of them as the 25th dynasty, and continued to build hundreds more until the first few centuries AD. And unlike Egyptian pyramids, we know precisely how these were constructed. They often had a gold capstone, which is where I believe the rumor that Egyptian ones did came from. Most were stolen in antiquity, some were stolen in the 1800s, and they were built using a wooden crane called a shaduf. Here you can see an ancient Egyptian painting of this type of crane used in a well, and below it is a modern example. And while they obviously can't build literally from the top down, where do you think they put this crane? They embedded them in the top. They erected a pole which marked the center point of the pyramid and used it as a fulcrum for the lever to build the structure up around it. We know this because they simply left them there when they were done, covered up with the capstone. So it's being built by a machine at the top. I think this is what Herodotus was describing. He may have thought he was describing the Giza construction, but it was likely being told by the Egyptian how the Kush were currently building pyramids. I imagine the language barrier between them is the source of the confusion. Let's get some quick terminology out of the way. Nubia is this general region of southern Egypt and northern Sudan. I will be using the term Nubian for any people living in or hailing from this region. Nubian is also a specific ethnic group, but I won't be using that word this way in this video. Kush is a specific empire that was largely set in Nubia, and I will be using that name to refer to the Kushite Empire specifically. If you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, you may already be familiar with Kush, as they assisted Judea and the Canaanites to fight off the Assyrians, and was home to one of Moses' wives. But the religious stories aren't entirely accurate, so let me clear that up real quick. First off, if you're not sure, although religious texts tend to spell Kush with a C and academic sources with a K, they're intended to be one and the same. The Israelites didn't seem to know how far south the Kush Empire actually went, because they just referred to basically everything south of Egypt as Kush. This included places like Ethiopia and Somalia, which at no time were part of the Kush territory. The Kushite were a powerful nation positioned near where the Blue Nile from Ethiopia and the White Nile from Lake Victoria converge into the mighty river the Egyptians lived on. This region was, in their time, quite a bit wetter than it is now, evidenced by the Kush's use of donkeys opposed to camels. Donkeys require way more water. They shared a lot with the Egyptians. Though they had a distinct and fiercely independent culture, they spoke a language entirely different from the Egyptians, but used the same hieroglyphics. Over time, the Egyptian language also became more common and would eventually become the dominant language. Everything I'm showing you here looks ancient Egyptian, but they're actually Kush. This is not to say the influence was one-sided. They strongly influenced each other and went back and forth in terms of relative power. Towards the end of their empire, they switched to a different hieroglyphic language called Meroitic that we don't really know how to read. So the last 5 centuries of the Kush Empire are a complete mystery to us, filled in only by external references from Egypt and Rome. They mostly shared a religion. I assume it likely started as 2 separate religions that sort of merged into one. Their gods, hierarchy, and many of the rituals they used were identical to the Egyptians. You can see the word Ra on this pyramidion, and this granite statue found in front of one of the pyramids is a statue of Osiris. The easiest way to separate them in your mind is to think of the Egyptians as a maritime power who occasionally used the desert, and the Kush as a desert power that occasionally used the Nile. The upper part of the Nile is not as navigable as the lower part, so most Kush trade and war happened over land routes. They were separated from Egypt by what are known as cataracts, which are whitewater rapids. There are 6 major groups of these between the Kush and Egyptian capitals. The relationship between the two was mostly friendly, but occasionally flared up into hostility or outright war. Conflicts with the Nubians is mentioned as early as the first dynasty, and the Egyptians were interested in the area because it was rich in gold. The Egyptian word for gold is nub. It's unclear if gold was named that because it largely came from Nubia, or if gold was already called that and Nubia basically means land of gold. It could also be coincidental and have nothing to do with each other. On the famous Palmyra stone, Snefru's conquests of the surrounding regions were recorded. He conquered Libya and Lebanon and seemed unstoppable until he slammed into the Kush. While he established some outposts and captured 7,000 Nubians and 200,000 cattle and sheep, the Kush war machine was more than capable of keeping even the mighty warlord Snefru at bay. The Kush would remain a powerful southern pure power for the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. But the stalemate with Snefru transitioned into a flourishing trading relationship, and it likely wasn't worth disrupting that trade for either side to consider attacking the other. But by 2100 BC, the pharaohs of Egypt started building big defensive fortresses on their border, indicating that the Nubians had become aggressive, likely coming from the city of Kerma, which was the capital of the new Kush established about 3 centuries earlier. By 2000 BC, the Kush attacked the Egyptians and launched a war. I have to point out, though, that this information largely comes from the Egyptians, so consider the likely bias in this account. The war doesn't seem to have been decisive, and both empires survived and began trading with each other again. But the 18th dynasty, or 1500s BC, the dynamic had reversed, and it would be the Egyptians that would launch their own invasion of Kush. You know that royal tomb that was recently discovered of Thutmose II? This was his campaign. Thutmose won the war. Kind of. He took some cities, but like his predecessors, he was not able to subjugate Kush in its entirety. It wasn't until the 8th century BC and the 23rd dynasty, or the Tannites, that large swaths of Nubia were actually annexed. Though I'm not even sure you could call it an Egyptian conquest at this point. This was during the Third Intermediate period, and there was constant power struggles. The forces that invaded Nubia actually had already lost control of Lower Egypt, so this was not Egypt as a whole invading Kush. The 23rd dynasty ended with the kings having barely managed to wrangle control of Upper and Lower Egypt, and on his death a power vacuum formed in which a chaotic 24th dynasty began. Though the Kush territory had been annexed, the Kush people still existed, and even parts of their empire remained independent, and their new king Pai began a 20-year campaign to consolidate power, eventually launching the 25th dynasty with the Kush as the new pharaohs. In fact, personally, I do not expect Thutmose II's tomb to be in its original condition because of Pai. Pai seems to have been a fairly petty individual who burned entire towns for defying him. Egyptian pharaohs already had a history of desecrating the burials of predecessors they had issues with, and I imagine the pharaoh who attacked them might be on the short list to have their nose knocked off if they could find him. This time period is occasionally called the era of the Black Pharaohs. You may find this kind of strange considering we're literally in Africa, but recent DNA evidence has shown us that most of the ancient Egyptian DNA actually came from the Jordan region. These are what you'd call a genetic back to Africa group. Modern Egyptians look like this. While what's black is subjective to your own interpretation, personally as an artist, I would describe them as just generally dark Mediterranean looking, though DNA of modern Egyptians actually have about 8% more African DNA in them now than their ancestors did. Egypt has a heterogeneous population, and it has always been that way, due to its location at the nexus of Africa, the Middle East, and Europe via the Mediterranean. It even had white rulers like Cleopatra, Alexander, and possibly Ramses. So the Kush were darker than most Egyptians. I'd say the era of black pharaohs is an apt description, although for obvious reasons it's fallen out of favor for simply the Kush period. I only mention it because you'll find it in older books if you go reading. By this point, Egypt had not built a pyramid in over 1,000 years. But the Kush were unusually obsessed with the old culture. They spoke only Egyptian, did Egyptian religious and funerary rituals, and for all practical purposes were Egyptian despite being technically foreign rulers. This mixing of culture had been happening for centuries at this point. Wealthy Kushites would often send their children to Thebes or Memphis for education. King Pi revitalized many of the old temples built by previous Egyptian kings, and brought Egyptian masons and architects with him to Kerma, which was the capital of the Kush Empire and became the new capital of Egypt during this dynasty. This is his pyramid, the first one the Egyptians had built since the Middle Kingdom, and it is the largest one at El Qura, the first of 3 royal necropolises the Kush had. The Egypt obsession may have just been Pi being the world's first recorded weeb. But in my opinion, he was likely trying to create as many links as possible between himself and the old kings to legitimize himself. This is not uncommon when new rulers usurp old families, even from centuries before. Hell, World War II fascists tried to directly link themselves to Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, or First Reich, to legitimize their rule, even if it just meant making shit up, like the quote-unquote Roman salute, which the Romans never did. So King Pi showing reverence for the ancient rules and gods is a good start to legitimize his rule. There are 3 main Nubian pyramid locations. El Qura, which is the cemetery of most of the 25th dynasty, near the capital city of Kerma. This is where Pi ruled from and was buried. Nuri is just up the river from the city of Napata, which started being used at the tail end of the 25th dynasty, and continued during the Sate control over Lower Egypt. And finally, Meroe, which is where they ended up and is the least understood because it corresponds to their change in their language to Meroitic. Since we do not know how to read it, this era of history is largely dark. Meroe continued to be used as a necropolis until the 4th century AD and is home to more pyramids than any other site on Earth. The Kush built over 1,000 pyramids, 300 of which are still standing. Obviously, they didn't have 1,000 kings, but small pyramids were constructed for multiple members of the royal family. In Nuri, for example, there is a row of 52 queens, and then a row of other people that seem to me to be most likely queen mothers or other royal members, and then a row of 21 kings with the most impressive pyramids. The smallest were about 6 meters tall, or the height of a 2-story house, and the largest were thought to rise about 30 meters. The Pyramid of Pi seemed to have once had a steeper angle than the ones of Lower Egypt, but still not as steep as what would come later. These pyramids are mostly made of red sandstone, mud brick, and granite, and they often had a temple in front of them. The tomb was usually a single room cut into the bedrock below the pyramid and had a very similar design to ones you would find in the Valley of the Kings. Here, you can even see one of the most famous artistries of ancient Egypt in the form of the stars on the sky in the ceiling of the tomb. This video is an overview of the Kush and their pyramid. I promise in a not-too-distant future I will pick 1 or 2 of them and take you inside, but there are complications to that, not the least of which being that they are largely neglected by archaeologists and largely unexplored in a scientific way. They were largely unknown by Europeans or lumped with the Egyptian ones, as they are much further south and not quite as impressive as the easily accessible Giza pyramids. And this territory has never really been safe, or at least not as safe as Egypt for Europeans, though you can see etchings here. This one's from 1821. Giuseppe Ferlini was an Italian treasure hunter in the 1830s who looted most of the pyramids. You'll notice a lot of the pyramids have damage that doesn't look like natural decay. This is from dynamite. He blew the tops off of many of the pyramids, hoping to find treasures inside. Most of the tombs were plundered long before he arrived, and the pyramids are solid anyway. But with his new tools, he was able to thoroughly loot the place. We make fun of Howard Weiss for blasting his way through Egyptian pyramids, but at least he had his heart in the right place. Curiosity for the sake of knowledge and documentation. Ferlini was... Dude was a fucking demon. Ferlini is solely responsible for the desecration and destruction of 40 of the Meroe pyramids and left Nubia with countless riches from within. He did document the finds and tried to sell them, but buyers actually didn't believe sub-Saharan Africans could produce such finely crafted items. This is due to the culture being very poorly understood at the time, and, well, just general racism. In fact, it's still a dog whistle. Being married to a black woman, I'm very aware that to certain American Christians, they use Kushi interchangeably with the N-word. So, yeah. But luckily, Bavarian royalty bought the items and put them on display in the German museum, where they still are. We are very fortunate that he never found a buyer, because if he sold them, we would have likely never seen them again. The first real archaeologist on site was George Reisner in 1916. He attempted to map and explore the site, but found the majority of the underground sections flooded by groundwater, making it extremely difficult. This is a second major reason that research deep diving into any particular pyramid is difficult. He also didn't stay very long, and didn't explore them as well as he did the ones in Egypt, because during a dive into a flooded chamber, a staircase collapsed and killed 5 workers. Concluding this work was too dangerous to continue, he left Nubia never to return. From what I've read, nobody blames Reisner for the accident, but ultimately, as the leader, he was responsible for the team's safety, and I can imagine it kind of fucked his head up for a while. Between 2015 and 2019, the National Geographic funded an expedition and included divers to reach some of the safer tombs and remote control robots to venture into places far too dangerous for man. The insides are wonderful, albeit simple, and completely covered in reliefs. The Kush kings seem to be even more revered than the Egyptian ones. In Egypt, the king is always shown as smaller than gods in the reliefs, but in Kush art, they're at the same level or even stand taller than them. You can see some of the soft stone has been pitted and has deteriorated over time, but the relief carvings are still perfectly visible and cover the entire room. They appear to be telling stories from the life of the king. The inscriptions I've seen do not include anything like pyramid texts, but there are plenty of similar rituals. It seems the shape of the pyramids were not set in stone, as some are smooth, some are stepped, some have decorated corners, some don't. Most appear to have a normal tetrahedron shape, but there are at least 4 that were different. These 4 had a bent shape, and were built in rapid succession by father and son, and possibly grandson and great-grandson. The first, Nuri 8, was built by King Aspileta, who fought off another invasion from Egypt, and may have been the one to move the capital to Meroe, although he continued to use Nuri as a necropolis for a while after that. He is also believed to have built 4 additional pyramids at Nuri for his queens, those being Nuri 28, 40, 42, and 58. His son, King Amtalka, built Nuri 9, which is the one that is most similar to the bent pyramid. He also built numbers 26, 38, 39, 55, and 57. I'm not the first person to look at the similarities between Snefru's and Amtalka's pyramid. In Derek Wesley's book, Kingdom of Kush, he theorizes that Nuri 9 may have been suffering from structural issues and had its top shortened. What? I disagree, as there's no evidence of any settling, and the Kush continued to build the next one right next door on the same bedrock. So it seems to me like this was an intentional design that may have been invoking the imagery of Snefru on purpose. The next, Nuri 10, was constructed by King... Oh, fuck me. The king whose name is on screen. I usually at least try to pronounce these things, but nah, man, I'm good. This guy had a king or two between him and Amtalka, but it's believed he was likely either his son or grandson. The fourth pyramid I want to show you is Nuri 7, constructed by Karkamani. We're not sure who this was, but he ruled immediately after the previous king with the long name, so likely a son or brother. You'll notice that the numbering of the pyramids does not always correspond to the order of the kings, so keep that in mind if you do your own research. I believe this is another bent pyramid, though I suppose this one it's possible the top just has fallen off in a symmetrical way. So what seems to have been 4 kings of the same family seem to have purposely built bent pyramids. To me, this is further evidence that Snefru's pyramid was not considered a failure, and was even something considered worth emulating by future kings. You can see how some pyramids are still in very good condition and were not destroyed by looters. Others have been eliminated entirely, dismantled to the foundation by human activities. And others have simply fallen down and been buried into the sand. These sites are largely deserted. There are not lines of tourists coming to see them like in Giza. That's a good thing because it means there are less people to damage them. But it also means if anyone goes, they're basically there alone and can climb on whatever they want. Sadly, while I recommend anyone with the means to do so visit Egypt, I cannot in good consciousness recommend traveling to Sudan. I wish we could go see them up close. If you look for tourist videos on YouTube, you'll come up fairly dry. Hopefully, there will come a time where the whole region stabilizes and it's safe for tourists to flow in, but until then, do not go to Sudan. There are thousands of pyramids in Nubia, and I've barely scratched the surface. I could spend hours looking at these 3 sites, especially once the edibles kick in. If you'd like me to deep dive into any particular Nubian pyramid, please let me know, and I'll see what data is available. Thank you for listening. Post your thoughts on the Kush and their relationship with Egypt in the comments, and subscribe if you wish to continue to explore the enigmas of our distant ancestors with me.